Continue here. The affluent and their families continue to be targeted by criminals who kidnap their loved ones and demand ransom for their release. Earlier this week, police rescued 2 Portuguese businessmen in Soweto after they were kidnapped for ransom. For more on this, I'm joined by Chad Thomas, who's a forensic private investigator. Chad, a pleasure to have you on the program. Now, considering the operation led by the SAPS to rescue the kidnapped Portuguese businessman, of course, following that other incident involving the kidnapping of another Portuguese businessman, let's speak about locating and rescuing these victims. What specific strategies and technologies were employed in this operation, do you believe?
Good afternoon, Constantine. Good afternoon to the viewers. Without giving too much away, because you don't want criminals to be forewarned, therefore they're forearmed, we'd like to obviously give credit where credit is due. And coming off the back of the successful release of two kidnapped victims and the takedown of suspects in Mansfield by an intelligence-driven operation from the South African Police Services Crime Intelligence National Office, together with their counterparts at the Special Task Force, as well as counterparts within the private sector, we then found out on Friday the very disturbing news that another Muslim businessman had been kidnapped. Now, you mentioned in the opening that this seems to be targeting affluent people. It's not just affluent people that have been targeted. Yeah. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a rise in copycat syndicates across the societal spectrum. And people are being kidnapped in informal settlements for a couple of R100. People are being kidnapped in middle-class suburbia for a couple of R1,000, all the way up to these high-profile businessmen that are being kidnapped and held for significant amounts of money.
So in your work as a forensic private investigator, speak to us about the role that private security companies play in indeed these rescue missions and ensuring that people are saved. And how do they typically collaborate with the SAPS, for instance, in such high-stakes situations?
Look, SAPS has taken the lead in respect of the formalization of partnerships between the public and private sector. There's a well-known project called E2, which is Eyes and Ears, which brings together security companies in support of the South African Police Services. We call it force multipliers. And the security industry, as well as the private investigation industry that forms part of the private security industry, has a lot of tools and resources that they can assist SAPS with. But SAPS are the lead in any kind of serious case. So when you're talking about kidnapping, SAPS takes the lead. In this particular instance, a veteran intelligence officer, Major General Feroz Khan, has set up a multidisciplinary interagency task team, which is headed up by the National Intelligence Office of SAPS, and they work together with their counterparts. So they lead, and their intention is to disrupt and dismantle these type of syndicates. The security companies play a very vital role because a lot of the times the families are told not to make contact with the police. They'll make contact with friends and family who will make contact with private investigators, who then in turn will convince them of the importance of involving the police. The police are the lead investigation industry in South Africa, and nobody can usurp their authority. The police have put into place various mechanisms, including a war room, including the use of equipment. And as I mentioned, we can't go into too much detail about how they're doing this and how they're disrupting and dismantling, because we are seeing successes. But the fact remains is that this has become so very prolific because there's been so much talk about this the last couple of years, and the values of the kidnappings have increased exponentially. And as a result of that, we're seeing far more criminals feeling emboldened and joining this type of crime.
No, you're quite right, Craig, in that we're not going to use this platform to give advice to criminals, for instance. But given the increase in kidnapping incidents, are there measures that businesses and individuals themselves can take to protect themselves from becoming targets?
So moneyed individuals have got the resources to be able to buy bulletproof vehicles, to have security guards at their homes and at their businesses, and to even drive in cavalcades. We've seen security convoys these days that rival that of the president. But what about your average Joe? What about the people that are in the informal settlements, that are in the township communities and suburbia? We need to become more involved in everybody's lives. And it sounds strange because people have become quite isolated because of social media, because of the internet, etc. We don't seem to take as much interest in our friends and families as we used to. We need to know when somebody hasn't stuck to a routine. Remember, there's no required time period in which to report somebody missing. So if somebody hasn't stuck to a routine, you can't get hold of them, there's something strange about their movements, report it to the authorities. Speak to your children, speak to your friends, speak to your colleagues, and upload various tools that are available onto cell phones that you can track the individuals. We've seen an increase in what we call express kidnappings, where the suspects want to keep the suspect's phone on because they're using the multi-factor authentication of the person's biometrics as well as the passcodes to empty those people's bank accounts. So having that cell phone on means that at least you can be tracked. So from an express kidnapping perspective, it's vital that families talk to their children, their fellow family members, and they discuss the importance of having these tools at their disposal. And like I said, the most important thing is getting to know each other's routines, and if that routine seems to be broken, report it.
So, Craig, earlier on you spoke about the specialized programs or initiatives to help clamp down on this trend. But how effective are the current strategies being employed by SAPS in really tackling the rising trend of kidnappings in the country? Are there specific areas where improvements are needed?
So there needs to be a reality check here. The police can only do so much with their limited resources, manpower capacity, etc. We've seen how this multidisciplinary interagency task team headed up by Crime Intelligence National Office has been taking down syndicates. We saw the success with the businessmen that were recovered this week, and we saw that they were able to dismantle a syndicate and arrest suspects during the raid in Mansfield. But within a day, we saw another kidnapping. And like I said, with the rise in the copycat kidnappings, we have to be on edge. We have to be on our game. We have to be alert at all given times. The police are seeking support from the private sector, and the private sector is ready and able to assist the police in this fight. However, when it comes to the role played by the police, they are the key players in this. And for them to send out a clear message that they are going to dismantle and disrupt these operations, they need the necessary manpower and resources. And we know for a fact that although it's one of the biggest budgets in all of government, it's still not enough money. We don't have enough members on the ground. I heard this week that 240 police constables out of police college had been allocated to the Hawks as investigators. That to me is a concern, because these guys are coming out of police college, they don't have experience, they haven't created networks, and they are being deployed as detectives in the priority crime section. This means that there's a problem about the members that are leaving the police. We hear about all the boots on the ground, and we don't hear about the natural attrition that's taking place. People are retiring, they're taking their expertise with them. The private sector is encouraging them to move across. And of course, you've got the issue of frustration, where a lot of Hawks members are frustrated that they may not have the necessary resources. We heard that the Hawks are only 50% capacitated. So without having sufficient detectives, and skilled detectives at that, we're not going to be able to turn the tide on crime in at least the next 5 years. And the public sector is going to have to look to the private sector for assistance in the short term.
You're quite right in that if the numbers are anything to go by, we should be worried. And you urge that we need to be on high alert or be on edge. But the statistics show a significant rise in kidnapping cases, especially over the past decade. What factors do you think are driving this increase?
There's one simple factor in the South African context. There's little to no consequences or accountability when it comes to serious and violent crime. When one looks at the statistics of the most heinous crimes, such as rape and murder, the statistics are so low that they embolden criminals to up the ante. They start climbing the rungs on the ladder, and they start acting out more and more and more. An opportunistic criminal becomes a career criminal. So when you don't have consequences and accountability, you see the statistics. So South Africa has risen in the last year from number 7 in the world to number 6 in the world for kidnapping, number 1 on the African continent. You know, being number 1 is normally a good thing. Being number 1 for kidnapping on the African continent is not a good thing. It's the wrong message that we're sending to the rest of the world. It's the wrong message that we're sending to foreign investors, because it looks as if we have a failed state when criminals have the upper hand. But the reality is we've just gone through a successful election. We have a free judiciary. We have a functioning legislative. So we're not a failed state. Unfortunately, though, the message that the world receives is a negative message because of these serious crime stats when it comes to the most serious of crimes.
So, Chad, can you discuss, before I let you go, the importance of collaboration between the public and private sectors in really combating these kidnapping syndicates? What more can be done in this regard?
You know, you hit the nail on the head. Everything has to be collaborative. We can't be in silos. And when you look at what General Khan's done with this dedicated task team in bringing together the public and the private sector and the successes that they're having, these successes need to be replicated throughout the country. The only way they're going to be replicated is if all the role players understand that there's this need for collaboration. As I mentioned to you earlier, the private security industry, which includes private investigators, are willing and able, and they have the numbers, and they have the funding, and they have the resources. They are there as force multipliers. They are there to help capacitate SAPS, because we know that in the short term, SAPS needs all the assistance they can get from the private sector.
Craig, thank you Chad, thank you so much for joining us. That's a forensic private investigator, Chad Thomas, really shedding light on the complexities and challenges of addressing the kidnapping crisis in South Africa. He's been giving us his perspective in this regard. Now, as Ukraine's and Russia's conflict drags on, citizens are concerned about not only the protection of their territory, but also their history. Ukrainians say Russia is deliberately attacking their cultural monuments in a bid to erase the country's history and its identity, as well as to separate the nation. Let's take a look.
This monument to Ukrainian politician and historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky in central Kyiv survived a massive Russian shelling that killed 6 people in 2022. Their lives were lost, but Kyiv architect Slava Balbek is determined to save the things that remind Ukrainians of the nation for which they're fighting.